All right, I'm going to show you what happened back in the real estate market back in 2008 and why we are not in the same market as we were back then. So first, let me explain exactly what was going on. There was this idea out there. It was called originate and sell. And so all these loan officers, whether it was from New Hampshire all the way over to California, what they would do is they would underwrite and bring on subprime borrowers any way that they could. If you could fog a mirror, you could get a loan. Now let me explain exactly what this meant. So a subprime borrower was someone that had a low FICO score, which then it would be an adjustable rate mortgage. They even had negative amortization schedules, which means that you didn't even have to pay onto the mortgage any month. All the interest would actually just accrue onto the back of the outstanding principal, which was then called liar loans. You didn't have to have any income verification. So what these loan officers did is they were just selling to anybody that could fog a mirror or that could blink or smell. The reason why they did this, though, was because banks had such a huge appetite for real estate debt. Because what they would do is they would take these properties or these mortgages and they package them up together and sell them as a bond. It was called a mortgage-backed security. And so if you can imagine this right here, almost like a building, and this has to do with all the different levels of risk. And you have these things called tranches. And a tranche is just simply a French word for a portion of something. And what that means was at the very top of this bond was a thing called a AAA tranche. And then all the way down to the bottom in regards to the value or the total amount at risk, you have a BBB bond. These were all rated by rating agencies called Moody's and Standard & Poor's. And so again, just to verify, Moody's and Standard & Poor's didn't even look or pull back the layers of what was being underwritten in these bonds and in these mortgages. So it was simply an opinion. They had no idea or any clue how bad or how subprime that these borrowers actually were. And so when they would rate a AAA bond or any type of debt, it was based upon the diversification of that bond. And so when you had all these different, the more subprime borrowers you had, in their eyes, that was more diversified. And so a AAA rating was 1 in 10,000 risk of default versus a BBB was 1 in 500 risk of default. So in regards to the risk verification, they had no idea. There was no metric into their underwriting system. And so what happened was these investors came along and discovered that all these rating agencies has no clue what was actually in the bonds and how bad that they were. So these investors came up with these ideas, and it was called a credit default swap. And that was essentially insurance against default from a bond. And banks have been doing this for 30, 40 years. And what they would do is it was actually a hedge against any type of high profile client or long-term client that they had. When they would over leverage themselves or over extend themselves with credit, banks would essentially purchase credit default swaps in case that person was to default on their outstanding debt. But basically these investors would come in and purchase credit default swaps on these outstanding tranches inside of this bond. And what would happen is, as we could find out with all these teaser rates inside of these subprime mortgages, these rates would go from 6% and they jump up to 12%. And because there was no verification of income or there was negative amortization, all of these borrowers were underwater. And they had no money in the game out of the gate anyway. The loan officers didn't care because they were just basically originating and selling, and then the banks were packaging them up and then selling to the investors that didn't realize any better because all the ratings were AAA. That's basically how all of this stuff came together, but I'm going to show you in part 2 exactly why we are not in the same situation as we are today, like for part 2.